Story 1: The Funhouse Mummy. Elmer McCurdy was a bank and train robber killed in a shootout in 1911. His body was embalmed and put on display. It ended up going on tour, even being used in a couple of films. His body went missing in the 1960s. It turned up again in a funhouse that was going to be used for the filming of an episode of The $6 Million Man. The crew were removing mannequins when the arm fell off one of the mannequins, and they noticed a bone sticking out. The police were called. McCurdy's body was buried in Guthrie, Oklahoma. Story 2: The very sad story of Pennsylvania's Green Man, Raymond Ray Robinson, October 29, 1910 to June 11, 1985, was a severely disfigured man whose years of nighttime walks made him into a figure of urban legend in western Pennsylvania. Robinson was so badly injured in a childhood electrical accident that he could not go out in public without fear of creating a panic, so he went for long walks at night. Local tourists who would drive along his road in hopes of meeting him called him the Green Man or Charlie No-Face. They passed on tales about him to their children and grandchildren, and people raised on these tales are sometimes surprised to discover that he was a real person who was liked by his family and neighbors. Story 3: In my college town, there was one homeless guy who everyone kind of knew. He stood out because he always wore a black suit with no shirt and walked around barefoot with no baggage or shopping cart or anything. A rumor started going around that he was actually a famous painter whose work sold for thousands, and that he had a patron who took care of him, and he just lived like a vagrant out of preference and schizophrenia. Most people doubted it, including myself, until I met someone who knew his name: William Laga. Story 4: The Construction Clown in Cincinnati, Ohio. I lived in Roselawn and Bridgetown as a kid and started to hear stories from friends about a middle-aged man with a clown collar, hard hat, clown suit, and a construction worker's metal toolbox riding the public transit all day without purpose or milling around construction sites. There's no way that's true, I thought, until one day I took a bus to a local Kroger grocery store for something. As I walked through the parking lot to the store, I saw him standing outside the front doors, toolbox in hand, hard hat, white ruffed collar, bright red sweatshirt, overalls, and work boots painted yellow. He was terrifying. I milled around the parking lot for what felt like forever and noticed that most people coming and going from the store were avoiding the guy. He just stood there, not moving, in the middle of the entry and exit doors of that Kroger. Suddenly, though, he was gone. I didn't see if he walked away or got into a car or went inside, but I had lost my nerve completely and went back to the bus stop. As soon as I paid the fare and looked up to find a seat, there he was, just sitting in the middle of the bus. I realized the bus had also stopped right in front of the grocery store, so he must have gotten on there. Anyway, I sat one row back from him, and he didn't move or say a word until it was time for me to exit. I saw him again a few more times in the neighborhood, almost always in passing while he was riding the bus again or standing at various bus stops. He was always dressed in the red sweatshirt and overalls or a full-on clown suit. One time he had a shovel. Then one day he was just gone, and people stopped talking about him. Probably 20 years later, when I was in my 30s, I was visiting home and running around the city with my mom. We ended up in Covington, Kentucky, doing something or other, and were stuck in traffic on Martin Luther King Boulevard. As we inched up the road, I looked over and saw a silver bust statue of the guy. It was in front of the Hellman Creative Center. I completely lost it. Nobody, including my mother, had ever believed me when I told stories of seeing this guy when I was a kid, but there's a statue of him right there on the side of the road. Anyway, meet Raymond Thundersky, Cincinnati's construction clown. Story 5. There used to be a wealthy hippie community in the woods near my town in the 1960s. They were very rich, but imagine drum circles and a lot of cocaine. One day, they just disappeared. They abandoned the compound. Nobody knew why. They all left overnight. Assumptions ranged from an impending drug raid to a murder in the compound, you name it. Most people don't think it was real anymore, or maybe it was just some eccentric person, and the story took on a life of its own. I know it's real because I've been to the compound. I noticed many years back a weird road while driving past the area for work. It was overgrown and not on any maps. I took my lunch break right then and there and decided to check it out. The place was massive, with stables and several large houses now kind of caved in. Inside, Everything was still as it was back then. Furniture, dinnerware, clothes, and magazines. It was like someone had just left for the store, minus over 30 years of mildew and moss. Not a single car in the garages, though. Since people seem curious, I'll try to recover the photos from the phone I had back then. I'll have to do some digging in the barn to find it first. It's been over 10 years. No promises of success, but I'll post the photos if there's anything left that isn't corrupted. Update. The phone with all the photos and charger from those days has been found. It didn't wake up even after 12 hours of charging and wasn't detected when connected to the computer. Now it's sitting in rice for another attempt. I can't remember if the pictures are in the phone memory or on the SD card, but I don't have anything to slot the card into except for this phone. Hopefully, a rice bath will help. Story 6. Have you heard the story of the thief who fell through the skylight, sued the homeowners, and won? It's true, but it was a business, and it wasn't a thief, it was a drug addict jumping from one adjacent building to the next, and he landed on the skylight that gave way. He's lucky to be alive. He fell 2 stories. Also, the insurance company settled, so I wouldn't say he won a court case exactly. It was my dad's family business. Story 7. I grew up hearing about an abandoned psychiatric ward in the woods of Tallahassee. Some versions described it as an abandoned pediatric psychiatric ward. This was the legend in the 1970s. Sometime in the 2000s, when they built the Blairstone extension, there it was in all its abandoned, horrifying glory. Story 8. The Great Potato Salad Massacre back in 1976. Small Alabama town. Middle of July. Soaring temperatures. Southern Baptist Church summer picnic. Some husband put the potato salad in the back trunk the night before. Didn't know it needed to be refrigerated. At the picnic, he puts it on the food table. Everyone eats it. These are Southern Baptists, after all. An hour later, the fuse was lit, so to speak. No, 100 fuses were lit. The men were playing softball. The women were trading pie recipes. The kids were swimming in the pond. Mayhem ensues. Gastro explosions erupt in every last one of those that ate the salad. The massacre is what happened in their britches and to the outhouses the lucky few got to use. Everyone else either decimated and desecrated the bushes, the trees, or their car seats as they foolishly thought they could make it home in time. How do I know it's true? My grandpa is the man that was in charge of the potato salad. He didn't eat any, but my grandma reminds him all the time since they were excommunicated from the church. Story 9. Christopher Thomas Knight was an urban legend in Maine. Someone who lived in the woods and was sneaking around people's summer cabins. He was captured in 2013 after living in the woods for 27 years. Story 10. When I was about 12 years old, a friend and I were playing in the woods that were known for being creepy. While building a fort, a strange man snuck up behind us and yelled at us to get off his land and never come back. It really startled us as we knew the land was a public area and had never been threatened by an adult before. Several years later, we found out he was an actual bank robber, wanted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for years. We were building our fort a few feet from his stash. Story 11. Always thought talk of a Ku Klux Klan compound was typical small-town urban legend. I got into geographic information systems exploring for a while and downloaded additional layers from my county's file transfer protocol server that showed defunct incorporations and historical plat maps. Very real. Story 12. It isn't a legend yet, but as long as Old Bridge, New Jersey, exists, there will be the story of the mysteriously large dump of pasta next to a river that was labeled a terroristic act. Story 13. When I was a kid, all the other kids always told me to watch out for Uncle Jummu, meaning an old man who would snatch kids and do bad things to them. I used to think the name was made up and completely random and that no such man really existed. Well, it turns out there was a real-life pedophile murderer by that name who abducted 2 8-year-old girls, abused them, and burned their bodies to hide the evidence. The case was so brutal and shocking it quickly gained national notoriety, and thus the name was coined. This was in Finland, by the way. Story 14. Remember when they said E.T.? The extraterrestrial on the Atari 2600 was such a bad game that it crashed the entire games industry, and then they took all the unsold cartridges to a New Mexico landfill? Well, that isn't true. The game is okay, just a little broken, but multiple factors led to the game's industry crash. One thing that is true is that they did find that landfill site several decades later with many the extraterrestrial cartridges, but also several other games that they later auctioned for charity. Story 15. The North Pond Hermit. Things would go missing in this little vacation community, and people attributed it to some mysterious person. It turned out there was one. He lived out in the woods for 27 years without ever talking to anyone. Story 16. Okay, this isn't a known urban legend per se, but once when I was 14 years old, I was staying at my grandma's. The house was surrounded on three sides by woods or forest. I was walking up to the back door when something caught my eye. Sitting on a fallen tree at the edge of the woods was a woodpecker that was at least 5 feet tall. It was legitimately Woody Woodpecker. I stared at it for a few seconds, then ran inside the house. Now, what makes this better is about 10 years later, my stepdad and I were talking randomly about things, and the giant woodpecker came up. Before I could finish my story, he interrupted me and said he had seen a 5-foot woodpecker sitting in the same spot a couple of years before. He thought he was crazy and never told anyone about it. So, the legend of the 5-foot woodpecker was born. Story 17. I always mention this one because it's so famous it got a Snopes page back in the late 1990s. Close to where I live there's a drive-in, and in 1996 the drive-in was hit by a tornado, and the tornado just happened to go through a screen that would have been showing Twister that night. That's the true part. What everyone seems to fabricate, and I remember it being a thing when I was a kid, several people I knew claimed to be there when it happened, is that it happened during the screening of Twister. Some claim that they thought it was an elaborate special effect. This part never happened, as the tornado went through the screen during the daytime. Usually, outdoor movie theaters operate at night, so I'm not sure how anyone could have been watching a movie at the time the tornado rolled through. On top of that, there were no reports of injuries or deaths, and if a tornado was powerful enough to destroy a screen at a drive-in, and there were people there, you'd think there would be at least a few reports of injuries, among other things. Instead, the only report was damage. So, to recap, true parts: drive-in hit by tornado. Screen destroyed would have been showing Twister that night. Untrue part: tornado happened at night during the actual screening of Twister. Story 18. A local urban legend is that there is a series of tunnels that connect the universities and prominent buildings in our city's downtown. My apartment is in an old house built by a wealthy businessman in the late 1800s. There is an entrance in the basement. It's spooky as hell and sealed off, but my landlord has confirmed that's where it leads. Story 19. For the last several years in Toronto, gay men have gone missing in the village. The community was convinced it was a serial killer on the loose, but the police said no. These murders and disappearances are unrelated. It turns out that was actually the case, and the perpetrator was killing gay men, dismembering them, and burying them in and around the properties where he worked as a groundskeeper and landscaper. Story 20. The Subtropolis, the underground city. No one thought it was real until the 1970s. Now, it still catches people off guard, even people who have lived nearby their whole life. In Kansas City, there's a massive, mostly man-made cave system. It started as a government facility, and part of it remains guarded by the military to this day. Exact dates are still not known. But in 1947, it was sold to a mining company who, rather than collapse the whole thing and strip mine it, kept expanding it. In the 1960s, the Hunt family, billionaires from Texas Oil and owners of the Kansas City Chiefs, bought it and spent a decade developing it. In the 1970s, they started renting out warehouse and office space. These days, it's almost entirely warehousing, but there are some businesses that still operate out of it. You can drive through it. I think it costs a few bucks. It's very easy to get lost down there. It's unsettling how far underground you can go. It's a very large facility, 1,100 acres. Story 21. In Liverpool, kids are taught about Purple Aki from a young age. He has been locally known and feared for honestly 3 decades. He likes feeling boys' muscles and makes them do squats. He is completely real. He has even had court orders against him preventing him from feeling people's muscles. I hope you get raped by Purple Aki is a common insult and a very real fear. Story 22. Black Vulga. In the 1960s and 1970s, there existed an urban legend in Poland that vampires in black limousines were kidnapping people, preferably little children. It was a tale parents told their kids who would then tell their friends and so on. It turns out it was a rumor spread by the Polish secret police, who actually used black cars to kidnap people. The aim was that no one would believe someone who reported they had witnessed a kidnapping. Story 23. There are tunnels in my town that lead from an old residential school, yes, the one where they raped and tortured First Nations children, to a big church. We can't pave our main road due to them. They filled them with concrete quickly, so not all is structured well, and every time the town brings it up, there's always some excuse not to do it.